The low, guttural rumble of Big Bertha vibrated right through the driver's seat, up my spine, and into the fillings in my teeth. Beside me, Tony, bless his grease-stained, chaotic heart, was grinning like he'd just won the lottery and a monster truck rally simultaneously. He flicked a switch on the dash, a purely cosmetic one he'd installed himself, and a set of entirely unnecessary amber lights on the roof began a slow, menacing rotation. "You absolutely, positively, 100% sure about this, Mikey?" he yelled over the diesel roar that was currently causing Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning poodles 2 streets over to howl in existential terror. "Brenda's gonna have kittens, possibly a full-blown aneurysm, and I'm not entirely sure my insurance covers HOA-induced apoplexy." I just gripped the oversized grab handle, my own smile tight and a little wild. The scene was already unfolding at the end of my cul-de-sac, a small, unassuming white van from Hazmat Heroes, Inc., parked uselessly, blocked by a small, unassuming woman who was currently the epicenter of all my rage. Brenda. "Tony, my friend," I shouted back, the anticipation thrumming through me like Bertha's idling engine. "That's kind of the point. She wanted ominous? We're about to give her a 6-wheeled, 10-ton dose of grade A, industrial-strength ominous. Hit the air horn when we round the corner, will ya? For dramatic effect." Tony's grin widened. "You got it, Commander Mikey." How did I, a generally mild-mannered, aspiring hot sauce artisan with a dream of bottling liquid sunshine and a healthy respect for municipal noise ordinances, end up about to declare war on my homeowners association president with a decommissioned military decontamination truck affectionately nicknamed Big Bertha? It all started, as most suburban apocalypses do, with a little spill and a whole lot of Brenda. It all began with such promise, such innocent, fiery ambition. My garage, a sacred space usually reserved for forgotten Christmas decorations and ambitious DIY projects that never quite got off the ground, was undergoing a glorious transformation. Sal and Dom, 2 brothers who looked like they'd wrestled bears for a living before deciding contracting was a more stable career path, were putting the finishing touches on what I grandly called Mikey's Magma Global Hot Sauce headquarters. In reality, it was a very well-equipped, soon-to-be commercially licensed kitchen. Today was the day. Pepper Extreme Extraction Day, I'd dubbed it. A day that would live in infamy, though I didn't know it yet. "Sal, you absolutely sure this ventilation hood needs to be powerful enough to suck a golf ball through a garden hose?" I asked, adjusting my slightly too tight lab coat. I'd bought it online. It said, Chief Culinary Chemist. I felt it added a certain je ne sais quoi to the proceedings. Sal, a man of few words and many grunts, tightened a final bolt. "Kid, with the kind of peppers you're messing with, we're lucky we ain't gotta wear astronaut suits. One wrong move and you'll be tasting colors for a week." Dom, emerging from under the gleaming new stainless steel sink, wiped grease from his forehead with the back of his hand. "He's right, Mikey. My cousin Frankie? He tried to make his own ghost pepper salsa once, sneezed while he was chopping 'em, singed off his eyebrows. Eyebrows, Mikey. They never grew back the same. Looked like 2 startled caterpillars for the rest of his days." I chuckled, though a little nervously. They weren't wrong. The peppers I was working with today, a terrifying hybrid of scorpion peppers, Carolina Reapers, and something my supplier only referred to as dragon's tears, were not for the faint of heart, or nostril. And then the spill. It wasn't dramatic in a Hollywood explosion kind of way, more of a clumsy, slow-motion catastrophe. I was transferring a tray of freshly mashed pepper concentrate, a vibrant, angry orange goo that smelled like the sun's angry core mixed with pure, unadulterated regret, when my elbow caught the edge of the counter. The tray wobbled. Time seemed to slow. I saw Sal's eyes widen. Dom muttered something that sounded suspiciously like a prayer to a long-forgotten saint of safe food handling. Splat. A good quart of the incandescent magma-like substance was now artistically adorning a 3-square-foot section of the pristine, freshly sealed concrete floor. The aroma intensified, going from potentially hazardous to, dear God, my lungs are melting. Well, I said, staring at the spicy, abstract art. My voice was a little squeaky. That's not ideal. Sal peered at the goo, his face a mask of professional concern. Okay, that stuff ain't nuclear waste, but it ain't exactly potpourri either. You're gonna want professionals for that, Mikey. Not 'cause it's dangerous. Dangerous, but 'cause if Brenda gets a whiff of this and sees you with a bucket and mop, she'll have FEMA, the CDC, and probably the Space Force cordoning off the block. He was right. Brenda, our HOA president, had a nose for trouble and a bylaw book thicker than a phone book for a city twice our size. An ounce of prevention, in this case, was worth a metric ton of dealing with Brenda in full righteous indignation mode. Overkill for a pepper spill? Absolutely. But a documented professional cleanup by a licensed team? That was HOA kryptonite. Or so I foolishly, naively believed. I hadn't even picked up the phone to Google Hazmat for overly ambitious chili incidents when the shadow fell across the open garage door. It was her, Brenda. She moved with a preternatural quietness for a woman whose primary mode of communication was a tightly controlled shriek. It was like she had a built-in bylaw infraction radar, a sixth sense for anything that might disrupt the beige-toned tranquility of our cul-de-sac. "Michael," she called out, her voice already laced with the carefully modulated suspicion that was her trademark. She hadn't seen the spill yet. She was still on the driveway, her eyes narrowed, her nose twitching like a bloodhound's on a hot trail. "What is that pungent aroma? It's rather unneighborly, and frankly a bit alarming." I stepped out, trying to block her view of the orange crime scene on the floor, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. "Morning, Brenda. Just a little culinary experimentation. The sweet smell of innovation. Top secret recipe, you know." I gave her a conspiratorial wink. It bounced off her like a Nerf dart off a tank. Her eyes, the color of faded denim and just as unforgiving, scanned the garage. "It smells unpermitted, Michael. Section 7, subsection C, paragraph 2 of the Community Guidelines clearly states, all aromas emanating from a private residence must be of a commonly accepted and pleasant nature, such as baking cookies or freshly mown grass. This," she sniffed disdainfully, "is neither." She still hadn't spotted the main event, just the general glorious, pepper-infused air that was currently making the squirrels in the oak tree across the street consider relocating to another county. Sal and Dom, to their credit, were suddenly very busy inspecting a light fixture in the far corner, their backs to her. "I assure you, Brenda," I said, trying for breezy and landing somewhere near mildly panicked. "It's all perfectly safe, just a bit potent. Like your award-winning roses, but for the discerning palate. A certain robustness of character, you might say." Her lips thinned. This was not a compliment she was prepared to accept. She made a small, precise note on the clipboard that was her constant companion, her scepter of suburban power. The pen scratched against the paper with a sound like tiny claws. A note, the harbinger of doom. "I'll be monitoring this, Michael," she announced, her voice dropping to a tone that implied she was on the verge of uncovering a major international conspiracy. "Closely." She pivoted on her sensible orthopedic heel and marched off, leaving a chill in the air that even my dragon's tears peppers couldn't quite overcome. The battle lines I sensed were being drawn, and they smelled faintly of capsaicin. Well, she's a ray of sunshine, ain't she? Dom muttered, finally emerging from his inspection of the perfectly functional light fixture. She's just thorough, I said, not quite believing it myself. I pulled out my phone and found a local company. Hazmat Heroes, Inc. No spill too thrilling. Their logo was a superhero in a hazmat suit giving a thumbs up. It seemed appropriate. The guy on the phone, who introduced himself as Kevin, was surprisingly understanding. Concentrated capsaicin oil? Yeah, we get that sometimes. Usually from those chili eating contests. Or labs. You're not running a secret government lab in your garage, are you, son? He chuckled. I assured him my ambitions were purely culinary and non-governmental. He said it was a standard, if unusual, cleanup, quoted me a price that made my eyes water slightly less than my peppers, and promised a truck would be there within the hour. Sal and Dom had decided to take an early lunch break, strategically positioning themselves on the tailgates of their trucks in my driveway, like spectators awaiting the main event at the Coliseum. You know, Dom said, unwrapping a hero sandwich that looked big enough to feed a small family. My cousin Vinny, back in Jersey? He dealt with an HOA president. Guy was a real piece of work. It all started over a flamingo lawn ornament. A plastic flamingo, Mikey. Ended with a 5-year restraining order, and Vinny had to paint his house beige. Not eggshell, not cream. Beige. Official HOA beige. Color code 734. Sounds about right, I muttered, dialing my wife, Sarah, who was mercifully at work and away from the burgeoning aroma of impending doom. Hey, I said when she answered. Just a little heads up, there might be some minor drama at home. Brenda's on the warpath about smells. Sarah sighed, a long, suffering sound I knew well. Define minor drama, Mikey. Are we talking sternly worded letter minor, or calling the National Guard because your experimental kombucha exploded again minor? Somewhere in between, it's a pepper thing. I've called a hazmat crew just to be safe. There was a pause. You called a hazmat crew for peppers? It's a long story. Look, just try to keep the property values from plummeting before I get home, okay? And no actual flames this time. Please. No flames, I promised. Just a highly professional, very discreet cleanup. Famous last words. An hour later, right on schedule, the Hazmat Heroes, Inc. van pulled up to the curb. It was a standard white panel van, professional logos on the side, nothing too alarming. Dave, the team lead, a sturdy guy with a reassuringly calm demeanor, hopped out, clipboard in hand, and there, as if summoned by the scent of official procedure, was Brenda. She was standing at the end of my driveway, arms crossed, her own clipboard held like a riot shield. She looked like a particularly disgruntled garden gnome guarding a patch of forbidden mushrooms. Dave, ever the professional, approached her. Afternoon, ma'am. Hazmat Heroes. We're here for a scheduled cleanup at this address, Mr. Michael. He glanced at his clipboard. Brenda cut him off, her voice sharp enough to etch glass. Absolutely not. This vehicle is an eyesore. And what hazardous materials are we discussing? Is Michael running a meth lab? I knew those late-night deliveries were suspicious. The late-night deliveries she was referring to were, in fact, my bulk orders of artisan pizza dough. I hurried out of the garage, wiping my hands on a rag. Brenda, for crying out loud, it's for the pepper spill. It's food. I called them to be extra careful. This is my property. A property governed by covenants, conditions, and restrictions, Michael, she snapped, her eyes flashing. As duly elected president of this homeowners association, a position I take very seriously, I must inform you that this mobile contamination unit is causing significant aesthetic distress to the community. Agnes is distressed. We both looked across the street. Agnes, a sweet, elderly woman who watered her petunias with religious devotion, was indeed looking our way, but she seemed more curious than distressed, possibly wondering if the ice cream truck had finally arrived. Dave, bless his professional heart, tried to reason with her. He showed her his license, his work order, the MSDS sheets for the mild, food-grade cleaning solutions they used. "Ma'am, it's a food-grade oil, similar to, say, a concentrated vegetable oil. We'll be in and out in 20 minutes. No fuss, no muss." Brenda scoffed, a sound like air escaping a punctured tire. "Food grade. That's what they want you to think. I'm protecting this neighborhood from spicy oblivion, from unregulated capsaicin incursions." She then launched into a truly breathtaking recitation of bylaws that sounded like they'd been written by a committee of paranoid squirrels after a particularly bad acid trip. Article 9, Section Gamma, Subsection Epsilon. All sanitation and/or remediation vehicles operating within the confines of the Chestnut Hill Estates Homeowners Association must be painted in approved pastel shades. I refer you to Appendix D, Swatch 7, Peaceful Periwinkle, and emit no more than 40 decibels of operational noise. Your van, sir, she glared at Dave's perfectly ordinary white van, is clearly a disruptive shade of industrial white, and I distinctly heard its engine exceed 42 decibels upon arrival. My neighbor Chad, who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to appear whenever drama was brewing, was already live streaming the entire encounter on his phone. "Dude, it's going down. HOA Karen versus the Chili Men. This is epic. She's quoting decibels, bro. Get her. #spicy standoff. Brenda the Bold. #HOA Wars." Dave was looking at me with an expression that was rapidly morphing from professional calm to bewildered despair. Sal and Dom had abandoned all pretense of work and were now leaning against their truck, eating sandwiches and providing a running commentary that was, unfortunately, just out of my earshot, but clearly hilarious to them. My patience, already thinner than a ghost pepper's skin after a bad sunburn, finally snapped. It wasn't just the obstruction. It was the sheer, unadulterated, weaponized absurdity of it all. She wanted ominous? She wanted a vehicle that looked like it could handle a real crisis? Fine. A wonderfully terrible, magnificently petty idea, fully formed and gleaming with malicious glee, bloomed in my mind. I pulled out my phone, turning slightly away from the unfolding farce. "Tony?" I said, keeping my voice low. "Mikey, hey buddy. How's Bertha running these days? You busy? Got a bit of an HOA situation over here that requires a slightly more persuasive approach." "Yeah, the big one. How fast can you get her over to my place? And Tony, for the love of all that is holy, make sure she's got all her party lights on." There was a cackle from the other end of the line. "Say no more, pal. Bertha hasn't had a good parade in months. ETA, let's make it an impressively short 3 minutes. Consider your situation decontaminated." "Dave," I said, a grin I couldn't quite contain spreading across my face. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a heady mix of righteous indignation and childlike mischief. "Just, stall her for about 3 more minutes. Ask her about the approved shrubbery heights for corner lots. That usually buys some time. Or maybe the official HOA stance on decorative garden gnomes." Dave looked at me like I'd just sprouted a second head, but he was desperate. "Shrubbery heights, got it." He turned back to Brenda, who was now holding forth on the psychological impact of non-regulation vehicle lettering on impressionable youth. Brenda was mid-tirade about the unauthorized reflectiveness of the Hazmat Heroes van windows. "It could disorient migrating birds, Michael. Have you even considered the Avian Distress Clause, Section 12, Paragraph Foxtrot?" When a low rumble began. It was subtle at first, a distant thrumming, like a giant cat purring 3 counties over. Then it got closer. The ground beneath our feet began to vibrate. Little pebbles on the asphalt started to dance a nervous jig. Chad's phone camera, which had been dutifully focused on Brenda's increasingly florid face, whipped around. "Whoa, what is that?" Earthquake! Is this the big one, guys? Rounding the corner at the end of our quiet, tree-lined cul-de-sac, looking like something straight out of a disaster movie directed by Michael Bay on an unlimited budget, came Big Bertha. She was a decommissioned M939 series 6x6 military truck, now painted a glorious, eye-searing hazard yellow that made Dave's industrial white van look like a shrinking violet. On her back was a massive, impressively utilitarian, and entirely empty, but Brenda didn't need to know that, tank. Tony, my eccentric friend who collected and restored these magnificent beasts for fun, was behind the wheel, a manic grin plastered across his face. He'd even remembered to flick on the perfectly legal, amber, rotating beacons on the roof, which cast slow, dramatic strobes across the manicured lawns and tastefully neutral-toned houses. To complete the ensemble, as Bertha lumbered to a halt directly behind the Hazmat hero's van, effectively blockading them in, Tony gave a cheerful, deafening blast on an air horn that sounded like Gabriel's own trumpet, announcing a particularly rowdy Judgment Day. The effect was instantaneous and deeply satisfying. Brenda stopped, mid-shriek about the migratory patterns of the Patagonian toothfish. Don't ask. Her mouth, which had been forming the word unconscionable, simply hung open. Her clipboard, her symbol of authority, her Excalibur of petty grievances, slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered onto the pavement. Dave from Hazmat Heroes just stared, his own jaw slack. Then, a slow, disbelieving smile spread across his face. He looked at me, then at Bertha, then back at me, and actually snorted with laughter. Across the street, Agnes, who had been calmly watering her prize-winning petunias, dropped her watering can with a clang. "Oh, my stars," she exclaimed, her voice quavering slightly. "Are the aliens invading, dear? Should I put the kettle on for them?" Sal and Dom, who had been enjoying the show from the relative safety of my driveway, were now officially choking on their laughter. Dom actually spat out a mouthful of his soda, creating a small, fizzy puddle on the asphalt. Sal was just shaking his head, a look of grudging admiration warring with utter disbelief on his face. Big Bertha idled, her engine a deep, throaty growl, a promise of untapped power and bureaucratic annihilation. The game, as they say, had just been significantly upped. I let the silence hang for a moment, thick and heavy as Bertha's diesel fumes. Then I strolled towards the scene, hands casually tucked into my pockets, the picture of calm in a sea of rapidly escalating suburban chaos. Tony gave me a jaunty thumbs up from Bertha's cab, which was approximately level with my upstairs bedroom window. "Brenda," I announced, my voice carrying easily in the sudden, Bertha-induced quiet. "Since the Hazmat Heroes van wasn't quite up to your robust standards for emergency vehicles, I've taken the liberty of calling in a specialist. This," I gestured with a theatrical flourish towards the gleaming yellow behemoth, "is Decontamination Unit 734. We are equipped to handle situations of significant community concern, such as rogue pepper spills, or, overly zealous HOA presidents attempting to obstruct lawful commerce." Brenda sputtered, her face a fascinating kaleidoscope of colors, from puce to a rather alarming shade of magenta. This monstrosity. You can't, it's a tank. You've brought a tank into a residential neighborhood, Michael. This is an outrage, a travesty, a clear violation of something very serious, I'm sure." "Technically," Tony boomed, leaning out of Bertha's window like a cheerful, overall-clad harbinger of bureaucratic doom. "She's a multi-purpose tactical decontamination and hazardous material response vehicle. And she's perfectly street legal, ma'am. Got all her papers right here." He patted a comically large, official-looking binder on the seat next to him. It looked like it contained the unholy offspring of a tax code and a dictionary. Tony, bless his unwavering commitment to the bit, hopped down from the cab, a feat in itself, as it was a good 5-foot drop. He was wearing a ridiculously oversized, and, I noticed with a grimace, slightly mustard-stained, white disposable coverall he'd clearly found stuffed under the seat. He began a very serious, very theatrical, pre-decontamination systems check on Bertha, walking around her perimeter, kicking her massive tires with a knowing air, flipping switches that I knew for a fact did absolutely nothing, and checking nozzles that weren't connected to anything remotely functional. He even sniffed one of the tires with a critical expression, then nodded sagely to himself. Brenda was oscillating between apoplectic rage and stunned, horrified silence. This was clearly beyond her usual operational parameters of issuing fines for slightly overgrown lawns or improperly sorted recycling. She started trying to quote vehicle weight restrictions for residential streets, her voice trembling. Tony, with the cheerful pedantry of a man who knew his ludicrously oversized trucks, happily informed her that Bertha was, surprisingly, within the local tonnage limits for a Class B residential roadway. "Provided, of course," he added with a wink I was sure Brenda couldn't see, "she isn't carrying a full payload of aqueous film-forming foam, which, for this particular, shall we say, delicate mission, she is not." Dave and his hazmat heroes were now huddled by their van, trying very hard, and failing spectacularly, not to laugh. Dave caught my eye and mouthed, "You are certifiably insane. I love it." The cul-de-sac was silent, save for the rhythmic growl of Bertha's engine and the distant, frantic barking of what I assumed were the Henderson poodles, still processing their newfound terror. Brenda, recovering slightly from the shock and awe of Bertha's grand entrance, fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking. "Police!" she shrieked into the receiver, her voice cracking with a potent cocktail of fear and fury. "I need the police, immediately! There's a man! He has a chemical warfare truck. Right here in Chestnut Hill, he's threatening the neighborhood. Send SWAT! Send the army! Send someone with a very large tow truck." A few minutes later, the familiar sight of a local police cruiser pulling into our cul-de-sac added another layer to the unfolding tableau of suburban absurdity. Officer Miller, young, relatively new to the force, and still possessing a sliver of optimism about humanity, was in the driver's seat. Officer Krupke, who looked like he'd been personally disappointed by every single person he'd met since 1987, slumped in the passenger seat. They parked behind Bertha, their standard-issue vehicle looking like a child's toy next to Tony's magnificent beast. They stepped out, their expressions slowly shifting from routine boredom to cautious bewilderment as they took in the scene. Me, attempting to look like the picture of innocent bewilderment. Brenda, practically incandescent with rage, gesticulating wildly towards Bertha. Tony, still in his ill-fitting white coveralls, giving them a solemn professional nod. Chad, my neighbor, gleefully narrating the arrival of law enforcement to his ever-growing online audience. And the original hazmat heroes, now looking like hostages in a very strange, very yellow standoff. Officer Miller blinked, his hand instinctively going to his utility belt. "Okay, dispatch said something about a toxic tank and possible doom." He glanced at his partner. Officer Krupke sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the collective weight of 1,000 unresolved suburban disputes. He pushed his hat back on his head. "Just another Tuesday, Miller. Just another Tuesday in paradise." Brenda surged forward, her voice regaining its customary shrillness. "Officers, thank heavens you're here. This man," she jabbed a trembling finger towards me, has brought a weapon of mass destruction into our peaceful, covenant-protected community. He's threatening to spray us all with doom." Krupke turned to Miller, his expression utterly deadpan. "Doom, Miller, make a note. Possible impending doom. Suspect armed with large yellow vehicle." I stepped forward, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Officers, gentlemen, truly, this is all just a colossal misunderstanding. I had a minor, very contained spill of concentrated chili essence for my artisanal hot sauce business." I gestured towards Dave and his crew, who nodded in weary confirmation. I called a licensed professional hazmat team to handle it with an abundance of caution. "Mrs. Albright here." I gave Brenda a polite, if slightly strained, nod. In her official capacity as HOA president, unfortunately felt their vehicle was aesthetically inadequate for the task, and possibly a threat to migratory bird navigation. So I contacted my associate, Mr. Riggins here. I indicated Tony, who puffed out his chest slightly, who owns this vintage, fully registered, and entirely street-legal emergency response vehicle, to assist with what Mrs. Albright clearly perceived as a major environmental crisis requiring a more substantial response. Tony chimed in, his voice a deep, serious baritone he clearly reserved for official business. "Just here to support local commerce and ensure public safety, officers. All permits, certifications, and a rather fascinating history of this vehicle's service in the Cold War are in the binder." He hefted the enormous, mustard-stained binder again. Officer Krupke, to his credit, actually walked over and kicked one of Bertha's massive tires. It made a satisfyingly solid thunk. "She roadworthy, son?" he asked Tony, who beamed like a proud father. "Passed her inspection last month with flying colors, officer. Runs like a dream. A very loud, very yellow dream." Officer Miller, meanwhile, was attempting to get a coherent statement from Brenda, who was now listing every perceived infraction I had ever committed since moving into the neighborhood 3 years prior. This included, but was not limited to, the questionable height of my sunflowers last summer, the aggressively cheerful color of my welcome mat, and an incident involving a rogue garden hose that had allegedly dampened her prize-winning petunias, an accusation for which there was, I maintained, no credible evidence. Finally, Officer Krupke, who clearly possessed the patience of a saint, or was simply too tired to argue, stepped in. He held up a hand, silencing Brenda mid-sentence about the geopolitical implications of my unraked autumn leaves. "All right, ma'am," he said to Brenda, his voice surprisingly gentle, but carrying an unmistakable note of finality. "It's a big truck. It's an ugly truck, some might say, but it appears to be on his property line for now. As long as it's street legal, insured, and he's not actually, decontaminating your prize-winning petunias with it against their will, there's not a whole lot we can do from a law enforcement perspective." He then turned his weary gaze to me. "Son," he said, and I could have sworn I saw the faintest twinkle in his eye. "You enjoy this a little too much, don't you? Riling her up like this?" I tried to look aghast. "Officer, I am merely attempting to comply with what I perceive to be Mrs. Albright's very high standards for emergency preparedness." Krupke just shook his head slowly. "Right. Well, try to keep the strategic deployment of vintage military hardware to a minimum, okay? It tends to make the dispatchers nervous. And ma'am," he nodded to Brenda, "please, for the love of all that is holy and caffeinated, let these hazmat hero fellas do their actual job regarding the chili situation." The police, finding no actual laws being broken by Bertha's magnificent presence, as long as she remained on my property and didn't start, say, launching weather balloons, couldn't do much more than issue a stern-ish verbal warning to me about maintaining community harmony and advise Brenda against obstructing legitimate business operations. It was clear they found the entire situation more amusingly bizarre than criminally prosecutable. As they got back in their cruiser, I saw Officer Miller discreetly take a photo of Bertha with his cell phone. Officer Krupke just looked like he needed a very long nap. With the departure of law enforcement, a strange sort of calm, or perhaps stunned paralysis, settled over the cul-de-sac. Brenda, deflated but still fuming, retreated to the perceived safety of her own yard. She didn't go inside, though. Instead, she stood by her prize-winning rose bushes, her arms crossed, glaring daggers at Bertha. I could almost hear her mentally drafting a new set of bylaws specifically prohibiting the ownership of vehicles larger than a standard sedan or possessing more than 2 axles. She was on her phone again, no doubt escalating this to the city council, the state governor, possibly the United Nations High Commissioner for Suburban Grievances. Dave and his hazmat heroes, looking profoundly relieved, finally got access to my garage. The actual cleanup of the toxic pepper spill, the event that had sparked this entire multi-vehicle psychodrama, took all of 15 minutes. It involved some special absorbent pads, a spray bottle of something that smelled vaguely of lemons, and a small, wet vac. It was so profoundly anticlimactic after Bertha's grand and thunderous debut that it felt almost like a betrayal. Dave handed me the bill, a weary but amused smile on his face. "Well, Mikey," he said, shaking his head, "that's the first time in my 15 years in this business that my crew has ever received a 6-wheel drive, possibly military-grade bright yellow Escort to a condiment spill. You, my friend, are a legend, in a weird, slightly terrifying, and potentially very expensive way." He clapped me on the shoulder. "Your treat next time we're in the neighborhood for a less eventful cleanup, okay?" Sal and Dom were beside themselves with mirth. "Mikey, I ain't seen nothing like that since my brother-in-law Tony tried to move a hot tub with a rented forklift and dropped it in his neighbor's koi pond," Sal cackled, wiping tears from his eyes. "This is gonna be a story for the grandkids. This is—" Dom, ever the pragmatist, just shook his head. "Next time you order a pizza, Mikey, you gonna have it delivered by a damn chopper just to make sure it gets past Brenda?" I grinned. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, replaced by a pleasant thrum of satisfaction. I decided Bertha could stay put for a while, just as a visual deterrent, a friendly neighborhood reminder of the lengths I was prepared to go to for a peaceful, professional pepper cleanup. Tony, after a final, booming laugh and a promise to be on call for any further decontamination emergencies, no matter how horticultural, rumbled off in his regular, much smaller pickup truck, leaving Bertha standing sentinel at the edge of my property like a giant, yellow, slightly smug guard dog. The neighborhood was electric. Chad's video, which he'd titled "Suburban Showdown Ho Karen vs. Decon Truck. Cops Called," was already racking up views on local social media. Agnes, dear sweet Agnes, shuffled over from across the street a little later, a plate of slightly burnt but undoubtedly heartfelt cookies in her trembling hands. "For your bravery, dear," she whispered, patting my arm. "Facing down that yellow beast like that took real courage." She seemed to have gotten slightly confused about who the antagonist in the situation was, but I accepted the cookies with a grateful smile anyway. Maybe, I thought, surveying my domain, my garage, my driveway, and my temporarily subdued HOA president, with Bertha standing as a monument to my momentary madness. Maybe this hot sauce business is going to be even more exciting than I initially anticipated. The battle of the driveway had been won, decisively and rather spectacularly. But I had a sinking feeling the war with Brenda was very, very far from over. The immediate aftermath of the great driveway standoff of 25 was deceptively calm. Bertha sat parked on the edge of my property like a giant, yellow, slumbering watchdog for a few days, a silent testament to my brief, glorious victory. Tony, after much persuasion and the promise of naming a particularly fiery sauce after his magnificent machine, eventually drove her back to his lair. But not before a slow, regal parade lap around the cul-de-sac, air horn blaring a cheerful, defiant goodbye that made Brenda's windows rattle. Then, the letters started. It began subtly, a single, crisp, official-looking envelope in my mailbox, addressed in Brenda's impeccably neat, slightly spiky handwriting. It was a formal notice of olfactory disturbance. Apparently, the initial, pre-Bertha pepper aroma had caused significant emotional and respiratory distress to an unnamed, but heavily implied to be Brenda-shaped resident. A fine of $25 was enclosed, payable to the Chestnut Hill Estates Beautification and Aroma Abatement Fund. I chuckled and stuck it on the fridge with a novelty chili-shaped magnet. The next day, there were 2 envelopes. One was a cease and desist order regarding the temporary stationing of non-standard large-scale utility vehicles, military or otherwise, on residential property. It cited, among other things, non-conforming vehicle aesthetics, implied psychological distress to local flora and fauna, specifically prize-winning hybrid tea roses, and potential disruption of subterranean earthworm migratory patterns due to excessive axle weight. Another $50 fine. This one went next to the first. "Sal, look at this one," I said a few days later, holding up the latest masterpiece of bureaucratic warfare. Bertha was long gone by now, but her legend clearly lived on in Brenda's tormented psyche. This is a demand for a full environmental impact report and proposed aroma abatement strategy for Mikey's Magma, including quarterly air quality testing by an HOA-approved and, I'm guessing, Brenda-affiliated olfactory consultant, Sal, who was installing the final set of shelves in my now pristine garage kitchen, peered at the letter. "Olfactory consultant? Is that even a real job? Sounds like something a fellow with a big nose and too much time on his hands made up." Dom snorted from where he was caulking the new countertop. "Means she's still mad about the big yellow truck, kid. And probably that peaceful periwinkle comment. That was a low blow, Mikey. Even for you." "She started it with the decibels," I protested. But they just grinned. My collection of Brenda's greatest hits on the fridge was growing daily. There was a violation for improperly spaced driveway pavers, potential tripping hazard Section 4, subsection Q, a warning about the unregulated reflection coefficient of exterior window panes, possible disorientation of migratory songbirds, and my personal favorite, a notice of non-compliance, excessive cheerfulness of welcome mat, may induce unrealistic expectations of neighborly felicity. The neighborhood was subtly dividing. Mrs. Henderson, owner of the traumatized poodles, now crossed the street to avoid me, clutching her fluffy overlords protectively. Old Man Hemlock from 3 doors down, however, gave me a furtive thumbs up when Brenda wasn't looking and whispered, "Give her hell, son. She once tried to find me for the unapproved rust patina on my garden gnome." Chad, naturally, was having a field day, documenting each new letter on his social media with dramatic readings and increasingly elaborate conspiracy theories about Brenda's ultimate plans for world domination, starting with our cul-de-sac. Agnes, bless her heart, attempted to mediate by inviting both me and Brenda to a neighborly harmony tea party, an invitation we both politely and separately declined. Brenda, I heard, sent Agnes a strongly worded letter regarding the unsuitability of her herbaceous border for high-stakes diplomatic negotiations. The war of attrition was on. Brenda couldn't outmuscle me, not with Bertha in my arsenal, even metaphorically. But she could try to paper-cut me into submission. Little did she know, My tolerance for bureaucratic nonsense was second only to my tolerance for extremely spicy peppers. And I had a fresh batch of dragon's tears just waiting to be processed. Brenda's rose garden wasn't just a garden. It was her sanctuary, her magnum opus, her legacy in petals and thorns. Situated along her front walkway, it was a riot of color and fragrance, each bush meticulously pruned, fed, and probably psychoanalyzed. Her Duchess Abigail hybrid tea roses were her particular pride, having won Most Belligerently Beautiful Bloom at the county fair 3 years running. She was out there every morning, rain or shine, cooing at them, whispering sweet nothings, and occasionally, I suspected, threatening the aphids with tiny rose-thorn-sized pitchforks. The incident, when it came, was so mundane, so accidental, it was almost insulting given the epic nature of our feud. Sal, bless his clumsy, well-intentioned heart, was moving some leftover supplies out of my driveway. Among them was a nearly empty can of white, water-based, eco-friendly primer, the stuff we'd used for the garage interior. A sudden mischievous gust of wind, the kind that seems to delight in minor acts of chaos, caught the precariously balanced can. It tipped, it wobbled, it fell. A few innocent white splatters, no bigger than a dime each, arced gracefully through the air and landed, with the unfortunate precision of a heat-seeking missile, on the outermost leaves of one of Brenda's prize-winning Duchess Abigail bushes, the one closest to the sidewalk. It was a few white specks on a few dark green leaves, barely noticeable to the untrained eye. Brenda, however, possessed the ocular abilities of a hawk combined with the obsessive focus of a forensic accountant when it came to her roses. She discovered the desecration at dawn, during her ritualistic morning communion with the duchesses. The shriek could have curdled milk in the next state. It certainly woke every dog, cat, and light sleeper in a 5-mile radius. It had a certain primal quality, a note of anguish usually reserved for Shakespearean tragedies or discovering your favorite ice cream flavor has been discontinued. Before I'd even had my first cup of coffee, she was at my door, banging with a ferocity that threatened to splinter the wood. I opened it to find her brandishing a single, paint-flecked rose leaf, like it was Exhibit A in a capital murder trial. Her face was blotchy, her helmet hair slightly askew, her eyes blazing with the fury of 1,000 scorned goddesses of horticulture. "You!" she screeched, the word vibrating with a dangerous intensity. "You and your Agent Orange truck! You've poisoned my roses, my babies, my Duchess Abigail. This is chemical warfare, Michael. I will have your hazmat license revoked." I blinked, still half asleep. "Brenda, I don't have a hazmat license. And Agent Orange? Isn't that a bit dramatic? What are you talking about?" Sal, who had heard the commotion and ambled over from his truck looking pale and deeply apprehensive, suddenly remembered the primer incident. He shot me a look of pure, unadulterated panic. "The primer," he mouthed silently, his eyes wide. Understanding dawned. Oh no, I tried to explain. I showed Brenda the harmless, water-based, eco-friendly, non-toxic to plants and small children and probably even prize-winning roses paint can. I pointed out the minimal, almost invisible nature of the splatters. She was not listening. She was beyond reason, lost in a vortex of horticultural horror and righteous indignation. Her beloved Duchess Abigail, in her mind, had been targeted in a blatant act of chemical aggression. "You'll rue this day, Michael," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You and your pepper-fueled perfidy, you will rue it!" She stormed off, the offending leaf still clutched in her hand, presumably to be preserved as evidence for the inevitable war crimes tribunal. I looked at Sal. Sal looked at me. "Well," I said, sighing, "I think that escalated quickly." Dom, who had witnessed the whole exchange from a safe distance, just shook his head. "Kid, you got a real talent. Most folks gotta work hard to make an enemy like that. For you, it's just a natural gift." Brenda, it turned out, was not content with merely ruing. Brenda was a woman of action, especially when her duchesses were perceived to be under attack. Within the hour, my quiet cul-de-sac once again resembled a staging area for a minor emergency. Brenda, true to her word, had called everyone. The police, again. The fire department, claiming a suspicious toxic fume emergency emanating from the primer-splattered rose bush. The Environmental Protection Agency, or at least their local intern complaint line. And, to my utter astonishment, Channel 6 News, who, clearly having a slow news day, actually dispatched a bored-looking young intern with a large camera and an even larger microphone. Officers Miller and Krupke arrived, their expressions a perfect blend of resignation and, "Oh God, not this again." Miller actually sighed when he saw me. Krupke just looked like he was mentally calculating how many years he had left until he could retire to a small, quiet cabin in a state with no HOAs. Or roses. Brenda was holding court in her front yard, dramatically recounting the tale of the vicious, unprovoked chemical assault on her innocent Flora, gesturing wildly with the paint-flecked leaf, which she had now apparently laminated for posterity. The fireman looked confused. The EPA guy on the phone with Brenda sounded even more confused. I looked at Sal. I looked at Dom. I looked at the growing crowd of curious neighbors, including Chad, whose phone was already out, a predatory gleam in his eye. An idea, even more beautifully absurd, even more magnificently theatrical than the arrival of Big Bertha, began to take root in my mind. If Brenda wanted a decontamination, if she wanted a show, if she wanted to escalate this to the level of international incident, then by God, she would get the most loving, careful, ridiculously over-the-top decontamination her precious roses had ever seen. "Tony," I said into my phone a few minutes later, my voice low and conspiratorial. "Code Rose. I repeat, Code Rose. I need Bertha, full ceremonial gear, and about 200 gallons of the purest, finest, triple-filtered tap water you can find. We're going to decontaminate some horticulture. And Tony? Make it snappy. We have an audience." The spectacle that unfolded an hour later was, even by my recent standards, a masterpiece of suburban psychodrama. Tony arrived in Big Bertha, her yellow paint gleaming in the midday sun, her beacons flashing with a solemn, almost mournful rhythm. This time, however, the presentation was key. He and I were both decked out in brand-new, crisp white Tyvek suits, the kind that crinkle reassuringly with every movement. We wore full-face respirators, entirely unnecessary for water, but it was all about the theater of the absurd, and carried official-looking and completely empty silver spray canisters on our backs, connected by coiled hoses to nothing. We disembarked from Bertha with the slow, deliberate gravity of astronauts stepping onto a new planet. I addressed the assembled audience, Brenda, whose jaw had dropped for the second time in a week, Officers Miller, and a deeply, profoundly weary Krupke, the wide-eyed Channel 6 intern Chad, who was practically vibrating with excitement, his phone held aloft like a sacred relic, and a growing crowd of curious neighbors. "Ladies and gentlemen, residents of Chestnut Hill Estates," I announced, my voice slightly muffled by the respirator, but hopefully conveying the appropriate level of solemnity. "Due to a regrettable incident involving an alleged airborne particulate contaminant of an unknown but presumably hostile nature, we are initiating Emergency Botanical Purification Protocol Alpha 7. Tony nodded gravely beside me. Bertha's giant tank was, indeed, filled to the brim with pristine, ordinary tap water. Tony, with the focused intensity of a brain surgeon, had attached a special wide dispersion, ultra-gentle misting nozzle to one of Bertha's many impressive-looking, and mostly non-functional, hoses. Then, with the solemnity of a sacred ritual, while the Channel 6 camera rolled and Officer Krupke looked like he was seriously contemplating faking a medical emergency to escape this fresh hell, Tony and I began to meticulously, lovingly mist Brenda's entire rose garden. Not a harsh spray, mind you, not a power wash. This was a gentle, cleansing fog, a baptism of benevolent water. We treated each rose bush, each Duchess Abigail, each delicate petal like a fragile, priceless artifact. We moved with slow, exaggerated care, our Tyvek suits rustling, our respirators hissing softly. Sal and Dom, bless their supportive, drama-loving hearts, had even gotten into the spirit. They were on petal integrity and excess moisture management duty, equipped with soft microfiber cloths, gently, almost reverently, dabbing any excess water droplets from the leaves and blooms. Chad was losing his ever-loving mind. His commentary was a breathless stream of pure awe. He's giving the roses a spa day with a military decontamination truck. This is performance art. I don't even know what this is, but it's amazing. I'm calling the Guggenheim. I'm calling the Tate Modern. Hash Rose Rinse Hash, Deacon Don delivers hash Brenda gets mystified. Brenda was watching this unfold, utterly, completely dumbstruck. Her face was a blank canvas of bewilderment. This wasn't the aggressive, destructive retaliation she had clearly expected. Her roses, if anything, looked rather perky, refreshed, and remarkably clean under our gentle ministrations. The few tiny, offending primer specks, the casus belli of this whole ridiculous affair, washed away harmlessly, vanishing without a trace. And then, in a moment of pure, unintentional comedic genius, Agnes, dear sweet Agnes, piped up from the sidelines, her voice clear in a momentary lull in the hissing of our misters. "Oh, those little white spots you were so worried about, Brenda dear," she called out cheerfully. "That was just little Billy from down the street. He was trying to paint a ladybug on your fence yesterday with his mother's special washable chalk paint. He's not very good at staying in the lines, bless his little heart, and some of it must have splattered on your lovely flowers." Agnes, the unintentional agent of chaos, or perhaps a strategic genius of disruption. We would never truly know. Brenda looked at her, now pristine, gently misted roses. She looked at Agnes, who was beaming innocently. She looked at me and Tony, still performing our solemn, watery ballet with a giant yellow truck and an arsenal of microfiber cloths. Something in her face just seemed to short-circuit. The fury, the indignation, the years of carefully cultivated HOA outrage. It all just seemed to drain away, leaving behind a vast, echoing emptiness of pure, unadulterated confusion. She didn't scream. She didn't quote bylaws. She didn't even harumph. She just stared. The Channel 6 news intern, sensing a moment, timidly approached her, microphone extended. "Mrs. Albright, do you have a comment on this rather unusual gardening technique being employed here today?" Brenda looked at the intern. She looked at her roses. She looked at Big Bertha, still gently sighing out a fine mist of civic responsibility. Then, without a single word, without a sound, she slowly shook her head, turned, and walked back into her house. The door clicked shut behind her with a quiet, almost mournful finality. The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle hiss of our misters, and Chad muttering, "Holy, I think he actually broke her. The Dick and Don broke the HOA, Karen. This is going viral. This is so going viral." A strange, almost unnerving peace descended upon Chestnut Hill Estates in the days that followed the Great Rose decontamination of 25. Brenda was quiet. Eerily quiet. She still tended her roses, morning and evening, But there were no more glares over the fence, no more accusatory pronouncements from her porch, no more official-looking envelopes bearing her spiky, indignant handwriting in my mailbox. She didn't make eye contact. She just gardened. Silently. It was profoundly unsettling. Officer Krupke found me a few days later as I was loading the first official cases of Mikey's Magma into my car for delivery. He actually had a faint smile on his face. "Mikey," he said, shaking his head with a hint of something that might have been awe, or possibly just extreme fatigue. "You didn't just fight City Hall, kid. You waterboarded it into submission with its own prize-winning begonias, or roses, whatever they were. I've been on this beat for 25 years, and I've never, ever seen Brenda Albright speechless. Or you could just be the luckiest, craziest SOB I've ever met. Now, for the love of God and my impending retirement, please try to keep Bertha for actual parades and genuine end-of-the-world scenarios, okay?" I promised I would. Bertha, her mission accomplished, made a stately, honking exit from the cul-de-sac a day later, Tony waving like a returning, conquering hero, much to the renewed but short-lived terror of the Henderson poodles. And Mikey's Magma. It officially launched, thanks to Chad's viral videos, which had indeed gone spectacularly viral, at least locally, under titles like Decon Don's Rose Rescue and HOA Karen Gets Mystified. I had an unexpected amount of free publicity. My first batch of hot sauce, especially the Brenda's Bane extra hot variety, sold out in a single day. People I'd never met were stopping me in the grocery store, asking if I was the Decon Don. It was surreal. The neighborhood dynamic had definitely shifted. There was a new, almost fearful respect in some of the neighbors' eyes. Others, like Old Man Hemlock, now greeted me with a conspiratorial wink. Agnes had taken to calling me the Rose Whisperer, and occasionally left small, slightly squashed floral offerings on my doorstep. Chad was trying to convince me to start a reality show. I politely declined. Then, about a week after the great misting, I found something on my porch. Not a letter, not a fine. A single, perfect, deep red Duchess Abigail rose, its petals velvety and flawless, lying carefully on my welcome mat. There was no note, no explanation. I picked it up, sniffing its delicate, sweet fragrance. There were no thorns attached. Maybe Brenda had finally met an absurdity greater than her own. Maybe Agnes's chalk paint ladybug theory had actually given her a strange face-saving out. Or maybe, just maybe, she was simply regrouping, biding her time, meticulously planning a diabolical new addendum to the HOA bylaws involving the mandatory regulation of airborne water particles and the psychological screening of all new hot sauce entrepreneurs. I headed back into my shiny new sauce kitchen, the rose in a small glass of water on my gleaming stainless steel workbench. "Either way," I said to myself, carefully capping a bottle of my hottest new experimental blend, a fiery concoction I was thinking of calling Bertha's Kiss. The only thing truly toxic in this neighborhood from now on is going to be entirely by my own choice. I held the bottle up to the light, admiring its fierce, incandescent glow. The sweet, sweet smell of victory. And just maybe a hint of impending, glorious, 5-alarm heartburn for the unwary. The cul-de-sac was quiet. For now.